The Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad has provided train rides for almost 50 years through the heart of Ohio's only national park. On the surface, it may seem like your typical run-of-the-mill tourist railroad, but deep down it's filled with rich history not many people know. The rail line we now identify as the CVSR traces its origins back nearly 100 years prior to its formation. In 1871, 9 businessmen from the Cleveland, Akron, and Canton area incorporated the Valley Railway Company. Drawn by the large quantities of coal, iron ore, and other minerals found in the valleys of the Cuyahoga, Tuscarawas, and Conotton, the railroad was to act as a feeder to the burgeoning industries and lake trade. The route's original projection was from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad at Martins Ferry, Ohio, to Whiskey Island in Cleveland. Unfortunately, the railroad would never build past Zorville, where it terminated at a point called Valley Junction. Construction on the 86-mile main line initially started in 1873 at Canton, moving northward to Cleveland before stalling a year later because of financial difficulties. Work would not resume until 1878, with the first set of rails being laid near Old Ford Street in Akron. This part of the line officially opened for freight and passenger traffic on February 1, 1880. The southern segment from Canton to Valley Junction began construction in 1875, but halted later that year. It resumed in 1881 and didn't fully open until January 1, 1883. In the beginning, the Valley Railway did well until the company started struggling financially by 1891. A year later, in 1892, the railroad fell into receivership. Despite efforts to reinvigorate its finances, the company failed, and in 1895 it declared bankruptcy and was sold at public auction. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, seizing the opportunity, bought the Valley Railway and reorganized it as their subsidiary, the Cleveland Terminal and Valley. Over the next decade, B&O infused millions of dollars in upgrading the line's outdated and deteriorating infrastructure. Notable additions included the luxurious passenger terminal in downtown Cleveland, and later a massive rail yard and roundhouse off West 3rd and Quigley Avenue. As time went on, portions of the line began being abandoned as the mines and quarries dried up. The lack of these resources and the establishment of the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area in 1974 led to many surrounding businesses shuttering their doors or relocating because of stricter environmental and emission laws. Around the same time, Siegfried Bierling, executive director of Hale Farm and Village, sparked a friendship with Cuyahoga County Fair director Henry F. Lucas Jr. Lucas one day shared with him his idea of starting a steam tourist railroad on the old CT&V line between Cleveland and Akron. Bierling, immediately enthralled by it, was ready to make the plan a reality. However, Lucas revealed to him he had already tried once unsuccessfully. Bierling, ever the optimist, suggested that they try it again together. Both men approached the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, but when they pitched the idea, the company practically laughed them out the door. As they were being ushered out of their office in the terminal tower, B&O's vice president of public relations told them off the record he thought their idea was ahead of its time. He instructed them to come back again and meet him in 2 years. When they returned, they were told the same spiel as 2 years earlier. Lucas had had enough by this point as they weren't making any traction and abandoned the idea. Bierling, however, wasn't ready to give up just yet. In 1971, he was made acquainted with Nick Maletti, Cleveland sports entrepreneur who was in the process of planning for the Richfield Coliseum. Maletti became interested in the railroad operation as he saw an opportunity to transport sports fans to his sports arena, though this never happened because the Coliseum was constructed 2.5 miles west of the rail line in 1974. Through his major influence, Maletti persuaded local movers and shakers to provide communal and financial support. On February 16, 1972, the Cuyahoga Valley Preservation and Scenic Railway Association, conducting business as the Cuyahoga Valley Line, was incorporated. Even after an exploratory bus trip and a test run with B&O officials, the company still wasn't fully convinced about the tourist operation. Fred Crawford, president of the Western Reserve Historical Society, resolved this after meeting with his friend Cyrus Eaton, the chairman of the B&O's parent company, Chessie System. With the green light given for the Cuyahoga Valley line, the organization now only needed a steam locomotive and passenger cars for it to pull. It just so happened a group called the Midwest Railway Historical Foundation was leasing space out of the old CT&V roundhouse.
National Railway Historical Society had various chapters, and the chapters were then geographically located. So I think a group of Clevelanders, John S. Foster I know was one, and I think Clark Lord was an early devotee that formed the chapter. And so MRHF, we called it MRF for short because all the equipment was stenciled MRHF. Midwest chapter was the Cleveland, Akron, Massillon, Northeast Ohio area chapter of the NRHS. And from what I understand, there was some rules and bylaws that didn't allow the chapter to own equipment. And these early founders wanted to have railroad cars that they could use for excursions and day trips, and maybe as a source of income by running various trips and things, which after a while they got pretty successful with. Clark Lord was a big proponent of putting together sometimes just one-day trips, and sometimes they were more extravagant affairs. They would do a trip to Mexico, not using their equipment, but they would sell a group package, and that was one of the sources of income for the chapter. So after a while, they had built up quite a collection of passenger cars. They had bought 5 of the former Erie rebuilt coaches that were used on the commuter train in Cleveland. They bought the Fort Eustis, which I think was originally named the Hot Springs, the Mount Baxter, which they named for the founder, John S. Foster. They had a New York Central coach, 2 nickel plate coaches, and then several other pieces of service equipment, a railway post office car that they used as a tool car.
MRHF not only owned and operated a collection of restored vintage railcars from the early 20th century, but they also had a 1918 steam locomotive. The 282 Light Mikado No. 4070 was built for the Grand Trunk Railway and operated in freight service all over the state of Michigan for over 41 years. MRHF started leasing the locomotive in 1966 and restored it for passenger fan trips beginning in 1968. After purchasing it in 1971, the group ran short train rides back and forth at the Conneaut Lake Amusement Park until being approached by the CVL. CVL made a 5-year agreement with MRHF stipulating that they would lease 4070, their passenger cars, and the group provide volunteer labor on board during the excursions. The CVL's first official run on June 28, 1975 was an evening cocktail party fundraiser called the Choo Choo Caper. At first, the trip almost got canceled when union officials refused to allow us B&O crew members to work as volunteers. Although Nick Maletti negotiated last-minute arrangements, 4070 suffered an overheated axle bearing en route to Hale Farm. Passengers had to wait for a diesel to rescue the train, bringing them back to Cleveland around 1 in the morning. In spite of the inaugural run's hiccups, Beerling and the group pushed forward with regular weekend excursions starting on August 17th.
I think Chessie System saw it as a kind of a PR advantage, and a lot of strings had to be pulled, and I really didn't find out about some of this stuff until afterward, that the different union negotiations that needed to be settled, and work rules and things like that, because we were going into uncharted territory. Volunteers running a train on, trackage that's corporate owned and run by union railroaders, that's going to take some some doing. So little by little, I mean, there were a few early trips where we were just about ready to pull out and, load people up, and they said, no, we didn't get the negotiations settled in time, and it was that close. There may have been a few canceled trips, or at least one that I seem to recall hearing about, but for the most part, it was a give or take, and things finally settled down to a routine to where we basically had a crew, a B&O crew that was steady, and they were happy to do the work, and it was essentially extra pay for them, and they worked right alongside us volunteers, and we got along real well together. So
one thing most people don't realize is that for the CVL's first 2 years of operations, the railroad boarded passengers at the Cleveland Zoo's Brookside Park entrance. The trip was planned to allow families to visit the zoo before departure and then visit Hale Farm during its layover to turn the train back north. Because the zoo was on a different B&O branch line, the train would have to transfer to the Valley Line at a location by Old Denison Avenue. This complicated things, as to get to the CT&V involved having to cross over a separate railroad company's line. Freight trains were prioritized over the passenger train, often causing delays for the CVL. In order to avoid this recurring problem, they moved the station to Granger Road in Independence in 1977.
Passengers, once picked up at the Cleveland Zoo, then backed the train down to RD Junction, and the 4070 would take off, then headed south or railroad east to Akron Junction, where the passengers would get off at Ira Road. Then at Akron Junction, we knew what to do as far as the Midwest train crew. We had to water the tender there. And the city of Akron had a hydrant set up with a water meter on it for us to use fire hose and get the tender topped off. So there was the other B&O train crew. They were running around the train with the diesel to get it at the tail end, and then we'd pull the 4070 past the cars and tie them on at what was the rear of the train and get ready for our run back to Cleveland. The thing that excited me most was the fact that we were running between two of the largest cities in the state of Ohio, and at the same time, there were several other tourist operations, but we were unique in the fact that, number one, we didn't go anywhere without train orders. So the B&O, I'll call it the B&O. It was chassis system, but it was still, the operating department, I believe, was still B&O, and they were still all B&O people. But so at Bridge 460, before every trip, the dispatcher had to call the train, and train orders had to be written up, and a train designated PX 4070, passenger extra. And where else would you run where I know we had to stop at RD Tower there more than once and wait for a Wheeling and Lake Erie freight to clear. One trip returning from Akron, I don't know how the message got to us, but maybe the train order was written before we left, but we found out that, hey, we have to take the siding in Peninsula and wait in the clear for it would have been an eastbound coal train coming down out of Cleveland. So I've got movies, in fact, of Doug Fink and a couple other guys thrashing the brush and cutting the brush back because we had to back into that siding and it hadn't been used in at least a year. I don't know how often the lumber mill down there would get cars in, but at this time they hadn't had any cars in, and there were some trees growing up with 2-inch trunks on them, so we were cutting and hacking away at some of the brush, and mainly too so it wouldn't scratch the side of the cars. But that was a really unique, and to me that was like a feather in your cap. Like, here you are out operating amongst the Class 1 railroad, and we didn't actually do anything on the main line of the B&O, but at Akron Junction, you know, turning at the Y, you know, it became, we had to cooperate with the operating department of the railroad. And that's so much, you know, a step above what your average tourist line was doing at the time. So I thought that was pretty neat. And even though it was kind of a thorn in the side for some people to have actual B&O operating crews there, they knew what they were doing, and you know, these guys had the experience. So working alongside them, that was, I think, a plus, you know, as far as if you want to learn railroading and listen to the stories they had to tell and things like that. That was a benefit, I thought. Plus, it combined the best of everything as far as, you know, we didn't get into downtown Cleveland, but, you know, getting to the West 3rd Street Roundhouse was pretty close to big city. I mean, we were up there with the steel mills and the River Terminal Railroad and, you know, big city railroading. And within a few miles, there we were along the old, you know, Ohio and Erie Canal and Cuyahoga River, and out in the rural deep woods. So that was kind of a neat, unique thing too. You know, as popular as the Strasburg Railroad is, I mean, we were running a 70-mile round trip. You know, I think Strasburg is, what, 3 miles out and 3 miles back? That's not much better than what we were doing at Conneaut Lake Park.
In the railroad's first 5 years of operation, over 90,000 people had ridden the train. While the CVL continued its growing patronage, the business side was the complete opposite. When Chessie System raised their track lease in 1980, the projected financial losses would have been too great for the already incurred debt. Instead of outpricing its customers by raising ticket prices, CVL announced they were canceling the season. In the 11th hour, however, local foundations and private individuals provided the financial package to keep the train going. Not wanting a repeat of the same situation, the board changed to have the CVL operate only on Saturdays, not only reducing lease fees by 50%, but also ensuring the train always ran at full capacity. While this plan worked excellently for the railroad, it indirectly hurt MRHF by slashing their revenue from their lease agreement with CVL. Because MRHF was now earning less money, they began struggling with the upkeep and maintenance for their passenger cars and 4070. Consequently, 4070 started experiencing frequent downtime because of mechanical issues requiring the use of diesel engines from Chessie. Both organizations ended up having to sit down and worked up a new agreement requiring CVL to pay MRHF a flat rate fee per run. In 1984, the railroad once again faced a difficult challenge when Chessie System abandoned the portion of the CT&V line that CVL used. Chessie did grant them permission to run the train over the line in 1985, but it required MRHF volunteers to fully operate it, and CVL had to take out a hefty insurance policy. That all changed in 1986 though, when Chessie canceled their lease as they were selling the line to a potential buyer. Thankfully, the unlisted buyer turned out to be the National Park Service. The NPS completed the $2.5 million deal on September 29, 1987, and afterwards issued a 5-year lease to the CVL. Unlike under Chessie System's ownership, where they were responsible for the line's maintenance, CVL had to take on the full burden of these responsibilities and costs. Another challenge was that Chessie was no longer there to provide a backup diesel if 4070 couldn't complete the run. CVL had to purchase its own diesel locomotive to prevent train cancellations. This 1952-built Alco RS3 locomotive originally ran for the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway until the company was acquired by the Burlington Northern in 1970. After a 2-year hiatus, the railroad resumed excursions on June 18, 1988, with this reopening run entirely selling out. The season was so successful that the organization was able to pay off all its debt incurred during its hiatus and had enough money to plan for the next year. This also allowed the railroad to move its cramped administration office to the Fox House in downtown Peninsula. For the first time since 1980, the CVL ran on both Saturdays and Sundays in 1989. Additionally, they introduced Wednesday fall foliage trips pulled by their diesel locomotive. MRHF volunteers consider 1989 as the perfect season because 4070 pulled every scheduled run without major incident. It was almost perfect for the CVL until its last diesel-only fall foliage train when 4056's main bearing spun, destroying its crankshaft.
We were coming down the hill. It was one of the Wednesday trips coming down out of Akron. Doug Fink was running, and we started to hear a bang and a thump, and we knew we were in trouble. And then she quit running about the time she crossed Ira Road. And I told Doug, I says, don't miss the spot because we ain't backing up if you do. And that's pretty much all she wrote. She sat there till we came with 4070 that Saturday morning to get her.
In 1990, the organization spiraled into financial turmoil due to deteriorating rail infrastructure, causing ballooning track maintenance costs. To make matters worse, officials had condemned the 90-year-old Akron Howard Street Bridge, preventing the railroad from stopping at its most popular destination. However, the biggest blow came when 4070's need for an overhaul forced its permanent removal from service. The CVL was at its breaking point at the beginning of 1991 as the organization questioned whether they could operate that year. The park superintendent, John Debo, also became increasingly concerned about liability issues as the line's condition rapidly deteriorated.
The Cuyahoga Valley line was in no position to try to maintain the 26 miles of trackage. They were able to undertake very simple repairs to switches or very minor kinds of problems with the trackage. But the big issues that were associated with maintaining the trackage, aging bridges, a complex set of culverts and drainage associated with the railroad, the rails themselves and ties and so forth. That all needed attention, but this small nonprofit organization, which barely had its nose above water in terms of their own operations, it was really quite unrealistic for this small nonprofit organization to be maintaining all of the real responsibilities associated with the trackage. The railroad was in extreme danger of being shut down by the National Park Service. And I know because it would have been my decision as superintendent to discontinue the arrangement that was in place for the railroad to operate. I was very close to the railroad. I was not a member of their board. That was prohibited by National Park Service policy. I did attend their board meetings. I was invited to attend railroad board meetings. And during those years, those what I call the early years of the arrangement, the new operating arrangement with the National Park Service, the meetings always sort of took the same format. How are we going to pay our bills? How are we going to continue operating? And from my perspective, as much as I wanted the railroad to succeed, and for as much potential as I thought the railroad had to provide a really valuable service to visitors to the National Recreation Area And it was not on one occasion, it was on several occasions when I would return home from a board meeting at the Hermit Club. I would draft the letter in my head. Here's what I'm going to say to the railroad, which is basically, thank you so much for your valiant efforts to provide rail service in the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. But because of concerns for safety and liability, I am going to immediately terminate our agreement. So I would write that memo or that letter in my head, come home, go to bed, and then wake up in the morning. And on the way to work, I would still have that memo in my head, but I would begin to waver and say, to myself, that if I shut down this railroad today, there won't be any prospect of future success, in part because there was some pressure on me and from the National Park Service to bring this arrangement to an end because of its fragility. And also, there was some interest in the National Park Service in converting the rail line to a trail, to do a rail to trails conversion. So by the time I would get to the office, I would have pulled back and said, well, okay, we'll try to keep this thing going another month or another couple months and see if some formula can be arrived at that will give this organization more of a solid footing as a partner operating rail service in the national park. So that went on, that same conversation I had many times with myself, coming just within a hair of shutting down the railroad, but then deciding I'll give it a little more time because of its potential value to the national park.
Ultimately, these liability concerns were resolved in 1992 when the Park Service received federal funding to take over all the line's track maintenance. One other potential challenge was the fact that the railroad had no available operating steam locomotive. The genesis of the Cuyahoga Valley line was to ride behind steam, not diesel. Taking a leap of faith, the railroad chose not to renew their lease with MRHF and leased 5 different passenger cars for their new Alco RS3 to pull. The number 4099 operated for the Delaware and Hudson Railroad until it was acquired by the CVL in 1990.
When we purchased 4099, of course, she still had the D&H lightning stripe on it, and we were discussing how we should paint it. And one of our volunteers, Don Miller, who's a big D&H fan, Don says, well, why don't we just paint it back the way it is? And that's, from there, when we got out on our own with the train was made to match.
"1991 could have been disastrous for the organization had it not made changes to their operations. CVL not only added more types of excursions, but started partnering more with the Park Service by offering narrated nature trips by rangers. It worked, with 1991 being their best year since restarting operations in 1988. To squash any future potential financial problems, the railroad established a fundraising campaign enabling them to better maintain and purchase more locomotives and rolling stock.
When I was a real little kid, on Saturdays, my dad used to take my brothers and I to watch the steam engine. That would have been in the very early 80s. And we used to drive through the park and watch the Cuyahoga Valley line go through. My parents probably got sick of me begging them to take me to watch the steam engine on Saturdays. And when I was about 13 years old, my dad knew somebody from the railroad, I can't recall who, and my best friend Dan Wagner and I started volunteering down there in the fall of 1990. We were both 13 years old. They used to do bulk mailings in the wintertime. That first winter, there wasn't a whole lot going on, but they would do bulk mailings to to try and raise money. And, we had to put information in envelopes and put the little 3-cent stamps on them, and they had to be organized by zip code. And we would do that in the wintertime. When it got warmer, they'd let us, sweep the cab of the engine out and do things like that. And the more we volunteered, the more they let us do. We, the next summer, we would sell Pepsi on the train. We'd be volunteer trainmen. But we did everything from help work on the track and to anything that they needed help with, we would try and help with. There were only maybe a dozen people involved back then. It was very, very small.
Not only did CVL have a small core of dedicated volunteers, much of the day-to-day operations were now done by Paul Lasky, the railroad's new executive director, who Beerling hired in 1988.
Paul was the director, which was the top position, and Andy Novak was the superintendent. And Paul did everything from raise money to, he would be conductor some days. The one thing I remember him doing, he used to pick Dan and I up at our houses because we couldn't drive, and that's how bad they needed help. But we used to have to flag the crossings, and Paul would drive up and down through the valley flagging all the crossings at Hale Farm and Independence. When the train got there, he'd be selling tickets. He really did a lot. He and Andy deserve, I think, a good portion of the credit for saving the railroad, because they put in a lot of hours. And, looking back, when you're 13, you can't really comprehend that. But they were definitely hardcore, and they put their heart and soul into it. From 1990 until I think the middle of the 93 season, we couldn't go to Akron because of the Howard Street Bridge. So the train would stop at Independence, Canal Visitor Center, but that was only certain trains, Hale Farm, and then we would stop. They called it the Valley Business District. It was behind what used to be Racks in the Merriman Valley in Akron, and that was as far south as we went.
We were able to open up a different option because we started doing 2 trips a day where you would go up to Independence, load the train, take people down there to Merriman Road or down to Hale Farm, and they had the option. They could either visit or just ride directly back. And of course, we picked up down there, and those people had the option to get off at the Canal Visitor Center up there at Hillside Road and visit it for a little bit while we went and unloaded the first and picked up the second. Obviously, the second people were just going to ride down and back, but it opened up. That was the first avenue for the Akron area to originate on the train, and it actually did not work out bad.
Originally, the railroad was very focused on providing services as a train ride. They were sort of selling the experience to the public as the ability to come out and ride a train, actually without reference to it being provided within the National Recreation Area. That wasn't the focus of the railroad's marketing. I worked with them over the years in kind of helping convince them that the real marketing potential for the train was not just that it was a train ride, but that it was a train ride in the national park, in the Cuyahoga Valley. My reason in part for doing that was I always had to justify why the National Park Service was expending the kind of money it was to fulfill its part of the agreement to maintain all that trackage and infrastructure. I think what makes our railroad so unique is the Cuyahoga Valley National Park is essentially a north-south park. It aligns that way along the Cuyahoga River. And we have an alternative transportation system now set up with the railroad where our visitors, if they board the train, can access almost any part of the national park quite conveniently by using the 8 station locations which run along the Cuyahoga Valley. And that service is really without parallel in the national park system. There are a few national parks which have rail access. For almost all of them, it's just access to a single point in a national park. And then that partnership really became even broader when we convinced the railroad to offer what was originally called Bike Aboard, where once the towpath had been built, which paralleled the railroad for the full length of the national park, that service was expanded to provide access to cyclists so that they could use the train in one direction to carry their bike and in the other direction to use the towpath. The access that it affords to the different parts of the national park and those experiences make it really, I think, one of the most important and significant features of visitor services that are offered in this national park. It makes it very special.
Looking toward the future, CVL's board contracted for a report to position the railroad for the next 20 years. On September 15, 1993, the board announced they were changing their name to the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad. CVSR also adopted new brand colors of gold, black, and red. The organization currently owns 26 pieces of rolling stock, mostly Budd-built stainless steel passenger cars from the 1940s and 1950s. Their most notable cars include 5 from the famed California Zephyr. These rail cars have been beautifully restored and contain much of their original fittings and decorations from when they operated on the Zephyr. My favorite of the bunch is the Silver Solarium, a 24-seat dome sleeper observation car. It not only has its own private kitchen, but it also has a built-in bar with a beautiful linoleum mural on its counter. CVSR's passenger fleet also includes 3 Budd rail diesel cars, or RDC for short. These odd pieces of equipment are passenger cars that can operate on their own without being pulled by a locomotive. Currently, only one is in operational condition and is exclusively used in charter service. Speaking of locomotives, CVSR owns 6, with 5 of them being Montreal Locomotive Works FPA-4 MBs built in 1959. 2 of them, number 6773 and B Unit 6871, were just recently acquired from the Grand Canyon Railway. CVSR's well-equipped Fitzwater maintenance facility takes care of all this equipment, performing repairs ranging from simple brake shoe changes to complex engine rebuilds. Presently, CVSR operates 12 months of the year, offering over 7 different excursions from breakfast and dinner trains to their most popular event, the North Pole Adventure. So let's climb aboard and take a ride on the CVSR from Peninsula to Akron Northside. This will be a condensed tour, as a round trip is about 2 hours. Along the way, I'll also point out some areas of interest you can see from the train. First up on our left is the Peninsula Passenger Depot, built in 1880. Most people don't realize this building was actually Boston Mill's depot. Peninsula's original depot was demolished in the 1950s, and the one here today was moved to this spot in 1967. As our train makes its way out of downtown Peninsula, we'll pass this building on the left side of the tracks. Originally built in the 1870s as one of the area's many cheese factories, it was remodeled into a home after it shut down. 4 years ago, the Peninsula Foundation renovated the house as an Airbnb. This next spot we're passing is Deep Lock Quarry, the deepest lock point along the Ohio and Erie Canal. At one time, there were 4 quarries located near here and shipped their sandstone by the canal and later the railroad. The site is now owned by the Summit Metro Parks, and you can walk various trails and see one of the quarry's walls. Roughly 2 miles south of our last point is Soleil's Farm and Market. They're known for their mouth-watering sweet corn and yearly fall corn maze. To our right is Indigo Lake, which was created from an open pit mine. Most of the quarry was graded by the National Park, creating 23 acres for recreational purposes. Two miles south of here is a water fountain at the entrance of the Conrad Boatsum Farmstead. At Akron Northside, we'll fly over the tallest bridge on the line over Cascade Locks. This point on the Ohio and Erie Canal had 7 locks within less than half a mile that raised boats by 70 feet. Well, as our train heads back north, I thought I'd throw in this shameless plug for a project I've been working on for the past 6 years. I just recently published a book that not only covers the history of CVSR, but the entire line's history. It contains 196 pages and is jam-packed with over 300 photos, illustrations, locomotive rosters, and other railroad data. To purchase a copy, there are links to both an ebook and print version in the video's description. I hope everyone enjoyed this video. Make sure to give it a like and subscribe to Railroad Street for more content just like this. Until next time, I'll catch you on the rails.